Kia ora, g'day, and welcome to the History of Aotearoa, New Zealand, episode 29, Amaa 2019. So yes, we have come to the end of 2019, which is not only the end of the year, but it is the end of the decade. But more importantly than any of those other things, is that it is the end of the first year of the History of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I actually recorded the first 4 episodes of Hans on the 31st of December, so at least at the time of recording it's not quite the first year anniversary, but you know, close enough, because apparently I had nothing better to do than sit inside and record a podcast that I had no idea whether it was going to be any good real late at night on New Year's Eve / New Year's Day, because I think it changed over to January 1st at some point. Anyway, as you will of course know, I have been calling out for questions over the last sort of couple of months or so to answer in the final episode of the year, which, as you might have again guessed, is this one, given I'm recording it basically 3 days before New Year's. So you guys have sent in a whole bunch of questions for me to answer in regards to myself, in regards to the podcast, and some other just kind of random ones that I'm not sure I'm going to answer. But yeah, so just kind of a bit more of an informal episode. You guys get to know me a bit better, because it is kind of important. It's not just a fun thing that I thought we could do, but it is kind of important to kind of get to know me a little bit. I think, you get to know my biases a little bit and my background as well and all that kind of stuff, just because that might impact how I perhaps word certain things, or maybe even slightly impact how I portray certain things and that kind of stuff. Of course, we do try to keep it as impartial and unbiased as possible, but it is, it's important to know those things as well, I think. Just because it can have a very minute impact, no matter how much you're trying to minimize it. Bias is always going to come through. It's kind of unavoidable in some regards. So it is a bit of that kind of more serious stuff, but it is kind of just a fun, dumb thing that I thought we could do because I didn't want to start the new episodes until next year. So I needed to fill in the gap, if I'm entirely honest. So you guys have sent in a whole bunch of questions, which was quite funny to start with. It seems that the Hans whānau is the kind of people that run by the philosophy of do today, do today, because I did put out this call about 2-ish months ago to try and give people the opportunity to kind of come up with questions and send them in gradually over that 2-month time, so no one missed out or anything like that. For those of you that did send in questions, the majority of you sent them in within the last couple of weeks. So I don't know what that says about you, if I'm honest. So this episode is going to obviously be a bit more informal. As you will have already seen, I'm adding in all the ums and the ahs and all that kind of stuff that I don't normally have in the regular episode, because it's all going to be vaguely unscripted. Obviously I've read the questions and I have thought about them a bit, so I do kind of know how I'm going to answer them, but it is going to be mostly just kind of unscripted, so there will be ums and all that kind of stuff, so there's that. So the questions aren't in any sort of kind of particular order, other than I've grouped them in terms of kind of subject, right? So there are ones that are about that are more related to me personally. Ask question. It's a question about who I am. Questions about like history or about the podcasts. That kind of stuff. So it's just kind of vaguely grouped so that we're not jumping from subject to subject all over the show. So, without further ado, let's start with the first one. These first questions being all about kind of who I am and a bit about me. Our first one is, can you tell us about yourself? Like, where did you grow up, your family, fun things you like to do, and places you've travelled? So let's break that down. Where did I grow up? I grew up in Invercargill, which is a city right down the bottom of the South Island. So it's actually New Zealand's most southern city, but it's also actually New Zealand's most western city as well. Because if you kind of look at how New Zealand is kind of shaped, right, the whole thing kind of it's not straight, right? Because people don't realise that Invercargill is New Zealand's most western city, because they just kind of think it's the most southern. They go, oh yeah, it is the most southern, but it's also the most western because the way that the South Island and the North Island kind of work, right? The North Island is kind of like a curved shape, and then the South Island is kind of like on an angle. I mean, that's not how like maps and shit work, but if you get what I mean, it's not a straight up and down north-south line, right? So the bottom of the South Island is actually more west of the entire North Island. So Invercargill is actually New Zealand's most western city as well. So Invercargill is the kind of capital city, if you will, of Southland, or Murihuku, as it is known in Te Reo Māori. And it is Southland's kind of got this reputation similar to that of the American South. It is full of, bogans / rednecks, has a bit of a reputation for, marrying your sister and that kind of stuff. Obviously doesn't actually happen, or at least doesn't happen as far as I'm aware. But it's kind of got that kind of backwater kind of reputation, if you will. So there's that. And we also have the thing of rolling our R's, which is something that you don't really see kind of anywhere else in the country. You do kind of see it in the kind of south of Banks Peninsula, south of Christchurch, but it is kind of it is associated very uniquely with Southland. And what I mean by roll my R's is with certain words, the R's are kind of extended. So the classic line is purple dirty work shirts, which for anyone who's from overseas, that won't mean anything. But for you guys who are from New Zealand and aren't from Southland, or even if you are from Southland, that will be very obvious. Versus the more kind of people who are from Auckland, you'll hear them say purple dirty work shirts. Again, if you're from overseas, you potentially can't pick up the difference there. But for Kiwis, that will be it's a very obvious difference. So that's very other end of the spectrum is purple dirty work shirts. That's very exaggerated. Whereas where I'm from, it'll be purple dirty work shirts. And that's not me putting that on. That is just how I talk. So it gives it a bit of the podcast a bit of a feel, if you want to call it that. So I grew up in Invercargill, which is here's another fact for you. Invercargill is named after the guy who, the architect or town planner who planned it out. His name was Cargill, because it was the Invercargill was settled by primarily Scottish immigrants. The Inver, which is the kind of prefix you see in some Scottish towns, like places like Inverness, we took the Inver part, slammed it against Cargill's name, and we called it Invercargill. Why? I have no idea, but that's apparently what they did. In terms of family, it's basically the usual kind of stuff. I've got a mum, a dad, a brother, and that's about it, really. Lots of other, obviously, cousins and aunties and whatever else on the periphery, but not much to be said there, actually. That's all quite boring. Fun things you like to do. This. Talking to a microphone like a dickhead. So obviously the podcast is something that I do for fun. It is something that you do as a hobby, so that there is that. But I also play a lot of video games. Right, I used to. I don't anymore. The podcast takes a lot of time now, but I do that quite a bit. Play a bit of video games when I can. Do a bit of reading that isn't related to the podcast, just so I'm not being super boring, just reading history books all the time. So read a bit of fiction and that kind of stuff. And other than that, I like to, occasionally get out into the bush if I can, although that tends to be a bit more difficult because you've got to actually kind of plan a bit and that kind of stuff. I don't tend to do anything too intense in terms of, overnight hikes and that kind of stuff. Physical fitness isn't quite there yet. But, getting out into the bush, getting out into nature a bit, that kind of stuff, I do quite enjoy that as well. As well as all the kind of usual, I like going out to the pub and, getting wasted. Well, not wasted, but, going out, having a few drinks, that kind of stuff, hanging out with mates, having barbecues, that kind of thing. All very kind of typical, I don't know, like things you'd see on someone's dating profile or something. I like to go on adventures and laugh. Like, of course you do. Like, who doesn't like to laugh? Like, who in your life do you know that laughs and go, wow, I hate that? I mean, just, yeah, whatever. Anyway, places you've travelled. This one might surprise you. Not very much at all, actually. I have travelled overseas probably, twice in my life. Both when I was very young. The first time was to England. Went to England for a thing. And that was when I was 10-ish years old. We did a whole bunch of things there. That was pretty cool. A lot of stuff that I didn't appreciate at the time. Like we went to, was it Lancaster Castle or something? I don't remember. It was a big castle. I remember we went there. That was okay. Again, didn't really appreciate it at the time because I was 10. And we went to Legoland and some other places as well. Did appreciate that at the time. And we also came back through Los Angeles and went to Disneyland, which was pretty cool as well. And the only other place I've been to is, of course, Australia. I went to the Gold Coast once, sometime, like maybe in my early teens at some point. I don't really remember that either. But yeah, I went to Australia on the Gold Coast, which is where all the kind of theme parks are and that kind of stuff. And that was pretty cool as well. Again, probably a bit of stuff there that I didn't appreciate at the time, but I probably would now. But other than that, I have not travelled very much at all in terms of at least overseas travel anyway, outside of New Zealand. I don't travel too often within New Zealand. I have obviously made my way up in the country in terms of as I just mentioned before, I grew up in Invercargill, but I now live in Wellington, which is the capital city at the bottom of the North Island. So what ended up happening was I left Invercargill, went to university in Dunedin, and then after that moved a bit further north for a bit, and then after that moved to Wellington. So yeah, so I've gradually made my way up the country in terms of, I guess, gradual travel. But yeah, I don't tend to travel too much outside of that, except for sometimes for work. I have done a little bit. By a little, I mean like a minuscule amount of travel when they tell me they need something. So, yeah, so I do a little bit. I do a little bit if required, but I don't really do a lot. And that, as you might expect, being a millennial, mostly comes down to the fact that I have not got a lot of money a lot of the time to do that kind of stuff. Of course, yeah, if I was motivated enough, could I save it up enough to do it? Probably. But yeah, I haven't. I don't. Because I spend it all on you people instead. So, not that that's that bad anyway. But yeah, so I don't do a lot of travel, and I haven't done a lot of travel really. Maybe one day. Right, on to the next one, which is how old am I? A very quick and easy one. That may surprise some of you, in the fact that I am 25, so I am not, I guess, not that old. So what is your day job? I won't exactly tell you what my day job is, just because I want to keep some slight amount of anonymity. But in short, I work in conservation here in New Zealand. So I work in trying to get rid of all the introduced mammalian predators that we have here, and trying to get our birds and lizards and insects and everything else to try and help them flourish. So that's kind of where those first few episodes kind of come from, or at least that first episode kind of comes from, and where obviously the Tuatara episode came from, the Hihi episode comes from, and all those Patreon episodes that are going to come in the future as well. That is drawn kind of from my background in conservation, both in the past and what I do now, as well as obviously research and that kind of thing as well. But it all draws from that interest, so that's kind of where that kind of aspect of the kind of, I guess, side path we've taken with some of the episodes, and that's why you will also find that there's a lot of, in some of the episodes there is quite a bit of that kind of natural I guess, natural world aspect, that kind of natural history aspect, that kind of stuff, because for one, it's because I'm interested in it, but also because I think it really is an integral part to how New Zealand was, kind of New Zealand culture, Māori culture, that kind of stuff, was the natural world is integral to that because of how unique it is here, in particular. Obviously, it's very important in other cultures everywhere else as well, but to understand a lot of what happens here, at least very early on in New Zealand's history, that is kind of integrally tied into the environment and how unique it is and all that kind of stuff, as well. So yeah, so that's kind of why there is that kind of, I know that some of you have noticed that there is kind of a kind of native species and kind of natural history angle to, or at least flavour to a lot of the episodes, and that's because I have a background in it and I have an interest in it, and also because I think it's important as part of that as well. So that's kind of what I do. When did your ancestors come to New Zealand? That slightly depends on whether you are talking about my mum's side or my dad's side, because I don't quite know on my dad's side. But I know at least on my mum's side, they only came in the 60s, somewhere around there. So at least on my mum's side, it was my grandparents that came to New Zealand. So at least on that side of the family, it is not. It's fairly recent. Their immigration to New Zealand, although I think on dad's side it's a little bit older than that. How much older though, I don't actually know. I don't know whether that goes back to the Europeans arriving in New Zealand and New Zealand Company and that kind of era, or whether it's more like maybe around the World Wars or just before, or I don't really know what happens there. So the only one that I know is that my grandparents on my mum's side arrived in the 60s-ish. Do you have any pets? Not me personally, no. Unfortunately, I rent a flat that does not allow dogs or cats or any sort of pets. I suppose I could have a goldfish if I wanted, but I don't want a goldfish. And I'm not actually legally allowed to keep a tuatara, so no. No, I don't have any pets, unfortunately. I would like a dog. That'd be pretty cool. Spill the beans on your favourite type of beer and brand. This is unfortunate because I actually don't drink a lot of beer, and that's for a couple of different reasons. I guess I would drink more beer probably than I do currently, but the thing is I have, I guess, particular tastes about beer, and that for a lot of people that I know, that's very disappointing because the beer that I like is basically what many people would call piss, because up here in Wellington, they have quite a large craft beer scene, and I'm not really into craft beer. I've never really been into craft beer. It's just, it's not my thing. So I find it very difficult to find a beer, at least in Wellington, that I do actually like. And so I tend to stick to things that I do actually know that I like, which usually is cider. I drink quite a bit of cider when I'm going out to the pub and that kind of stuff. But in terms of what my favourite beer would be, I drink a lot of Speight's if I can. Because that's the typical Southland beer, and a lot of people will be very disappointed about that, and I'm sorry. Actually, no, I'm not sorry. Speight's is great, but only if it's on tap. Otherwise, if you get it in a bottle, it tastes like arse, so don't do that. If you come to New Zealand and you want to buy a Speight's, don't buy the bottles, get it on tap. Always get it on tap. But you don't find it very much up here, but, and I get a lot of shit for it. Particularly from my workmates about drinking Speight's and that kind of thing, because they think there are better beers and that kind of stuff. But you go down south, you go to Southland, even in Dunedin, that's all the drinking is Speight's. Whole lot of Speight's. All right, on to things that are less specifically about me. How long did you think about this podcast before you took the dive into making it? What was it that made you decide to finally do it? So in regards to this one, I do speak about it a little bit in episode 0, so I won't try to rehash that too much. So if you are interested in that, I do give a brief summary as to why I started Hans. But to kind of, the way that I'm going to talk about this, I guess, is kind of give you a brief rundown of my kind of development of interest in history, because it's kind of all part of that, right? That's kind of it's kind of all linked into that. So my first exposure to history was or learning about history was sometime in primary school, kind of late primary school, probably year 4, 5, or 6. I can't quite remember when. That's roughly like, what's that, like, year 5 is 10 years old. So roughly 10 years old is when I first got exposed to learning about history. And that was when we were learning about Native Americans. Particularly, I remember we were talking about the Sioux tribe for some reason. I do not remember anything else other than that. Then we did learn about them. But I do remember that I did enjoy that. And then not long after that, we also did a kind of topic on ancient Egypt, which I also thoroughly enjoyed as well at the time. And I don't remember much of that either, apart from the fact that there was probably, we were talking about pyramids and pharaohs and all sorts of other stuff. But what I do remember from that kind of subject, again, we're 10 years old, but they decided to bring in a guy from Egypt. I guess one of the teachers knew a guy who was from Egypt who'd come over or something. I don't quite know how that managed to happen, but here we are, a 30 10-year-olds, and in front of them is a real live Egyptian. And of course, because we had been talking about ancient Egypt, we're talking, basically Ptolemaic period backwards, right? So basically everything Egyptian before Rome came to, major power. And so all of our questions were naturally kind of aimed around that. Things about pyramids and mummies and pharaohs, whatever else, the Nile, that kind of stuff. And of course, this guy being a modern guy from Egypt just did not know anything about that. He was so out of his depth. And this was partially because he didn't speak too much English. Obviously, Arabic was probably his first language. And so he's just trying to field these questions about like ancient Egypt. And he frequently got the question, "Are you a real Egyptian?" To which he would go, "Well, yes, I am." But he of course didn't quite understand the kind of backstory behind that answer, or behind that question, right? Because we weren't just asking him, "Are you an Egyptian?" As in, "Are you a person from Egypt?" We're asking him, like, basically, do you follow all those practices, beliefs, and everything else that we have just learnt about? And I just thought this was very unfortunate for the guy, because of course this guy could have been anything. He could, he probably wasn't even a historian. He was probably like a doctor, a lawyer, anything. He could have been literally anything. A computer technician, maybe he worked at the Egyptian equivalent of EB Games. I have no idea. He could have been literally anything. And he's got to field these questions about, Egyptian history and this kind of stuff. And the bit that I kind of find the funniest about all of this is the teachers kind of very clearly did not kind of think about the fact that Egypt, it had a really long history with, pyramids and pharaohs and whatever else. But of course it had a also very long history after that involved Rome, Islam, all sorts of other things, that, he just lives in a different time period. He's a product, essentially, as we all are, of our time and of our history. And so we're all sitting here thinking, going, wow, this is a real live Egyptian that practices all these Egyptians' belief. And it's like, no, he's a completely different guy, because so much stuff has happened since that period. So that was a bit of a funny story. So that was kind of the first kind of exposure that I had to learning history, and apart from those kind of stories, that's all I remember of it. And I never really, that's kind of where it stopped for a while. And then after that, the next time I encountered it was when in year 11, so at this point I was about 16-ish, you have to choose your subjects for the next year at school, in high school. And I got put in the position where I couldn't do ICT, which is Information Communications Technology, computer stuff. I wanted to do computer stuff, and there ended up being a timetable clash with like maths or something. And of course, Mum was like, "You can't do maths. You can't not do maths. You have to do maths." So I was like, "Okay, well, we can drop ICT. I'm bit bummed, but I can drop ICT." And so then, at that point, there was two choices that could fit into that slot: history or metalworking. And that encountered a problem because Mum was extremely adamant that I would find history boring. She thought I would hate it because she hated it. And she thought it would be awful and it would be so boring or whatever. And I basically told her, well, it's either that or it's metalworking. But she was so adamant that I ended up just being like, whatever, I'll just do metalworking then. Put that down and then went away in a huff. And eventually after talking it over, we both decided that, well, metalworking probably isn't something that I could do. So instead, we went back and changed it to history. And what ended up, kind of the funny thing about that was Mum went to the teacher in charge or whatever and basically said, yep, we want him changed to history. But, Mum kind of expressed the fact that she was concerned that I would find it boring, to which the teacher said, the history teacher who teaches it has never had his lessons called boring. And I think that's when we both kind of went, oh, okay, all right then. So, yeah, so I went into my first lesson in history, which was really, really good. I don't remember what we talked about too much. It was probably just an introduction. I know that in that first year we did the history of Ireland, Irish independence specifically. So things like Michael Collins, De Valera, those sorts of guys. So we started out with that, and in the first, so a lot of it was setting up kind of, I guess, the British Empire and kind of what it was, who they are, kind of, general overview of kind of, I guess, the world in kind of, early 20th century, kind of how the world was kind of made up and that kind of stuff. And I distinctly remember the teacher asked a question, because we were talking about the British Empire, what was the crown jewel of the British Empire? It was called the crown jewel of the British Empire. And he was talking about a place. He was referencing a place. And I don't know how in God's name I knew the answer, but it just popped into my head and I put my hand up and he's like, yeah. And I said, it's India. And he goes, yeah, it is India. And I was like, whoa. And he was pretty impressed, actually, if I do say so myself. Particularly when, the lesson was over. We spend the next 20 minutes talking about other stuff. Lesson was over, everyone's leaving, and he pulls me inside and goes, how'd you know that? And I went, oh no, I just knew it. Like, I read it somewhere probably. And it was kind of from that point on that I guess, like, I kind of knew something was up. Sort of in the back of my mind, and the history teacher kind of knew something was up as well. So that was kind of the very big kind of, I guess, catalyst for learning about history and the interest in history. Because then I spent the next few years learning about history, as you do, learn mostly European history, and I didn't learn any New Zealand history whatsoever. None. Absolutely zero. And that's mostly just because it was up to teacher discretion. There was usually one, I think actually in the 3 years I did history, there was only one kind of time that we could have learnt some New Zealand history. And for whatever other reason, the teacher didn't choose that. I don't know why. But yeah, so I never learnt any New Zealand history, which is of course one of the things that kind of sparked why I wanted to do this. So I got all through the school, and then after that I went to uni, basically doing constantly science stuff. So history stuff just went on the back burner. I had absolutely no time to be doing any history stuff. So I didn't really do any history stuff at all when I was at uni. But then I left uni, and after that, it was I liked as much as uni was hard work and that kind of stuff, I liked the mental stimulation of being able to learn stuff, of being able to read stuff, of being able to constantly kind of keep moving forward, expanding your brain, yada, 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 that kind of stuff. And I kind of found that a bit difficult, at least immediately after uni. I didn't really know, I guess, how to look for it or what to do, or, I just didn't want to read stuff and learn stuff for the sake of learning stuff. So eventually, I've discovered history podcasts because I was looking for something to do on my walk to work. It took me about like an hour to walk to work. So there was a lot of kind of dead time in terms of, I wasn't doing anything, wasn't learning anything, or wasn't, nothing was going on, I was just walking. So I thought, well, why don't I try this podcast thing out and see what I can find? I like history, let's try a history podcast. And that's really when it all kind of kicked off. It all really snowballed from there. I started with the British History Podcast, and I absolutely fucking slammed through it. All just under 300 episodes at the time. Absolutely smashed through it. And then the history of Rome, and then the history of Byzantium, and then something else that I probably can't remember. I just absolutely just slammed through it. And by that point, that was my kind of mental stimulation. That was kind of the, that's what I really liked. That was just how I learned stuff now, was through podcasts and listening to history podcasts and that kind of stuff. And then one day, a few years later, I wondered if anyone had done a New Zealand one, had done a similar thing like the British History Podcast, History of Rome, History of Byzantium, that kind of stuff. A chronological history of New Zealand in podcast format, like all those other podcasts had done. And I thought, surely, we're a reasonably major landmass. We've got 4 and a bit million people, 4.5 or whatever million people, nearly 5 million people. Surely someone has done it. Surely I am not the first person to have this idea, is what I thought. Lo and behold, it seems like I may have been. Because as you can probably guess, I went and looked and I couldn't find one at all. The closest I found was the New Zealand history kind of lecture series, which was pretty irregular, wasn't really chronological, obviously, and was just recordings of lectures. It wasn't actually what Hans has become now, or what I thought I wanted to find. So that was, that was a whole thing, is I couldn't find it. And from there I was just disappointed, and then just didn't really think too much about it. But eventually, over time, it kind of thought, well, maybe I should do it. Maybe I could do it. Maybe I could do it. And I kind of put the thought out of my mind, just because, you know, you hear a lot of podcasts, they say it's a lot of work. I didn't obviously have any recording software, didn't have any recording equipment. I knew that it would be a lot of effort in terms of research and that kind of stuff. I knew I wouldn't be able to potentially financially, put it up in terms of the research material and whatever else. There was just a lot of things that I thought, maybe that's not gonna cut it. I'm not gonna be able to do it. And whether I just basically had the mental capacity and fortitude to actually do it. So I kind of sat on it for a long while, where I never told anyone that I'd had this idea. And then I ended up telling a couple of people, and they were like, yeah, that's a pretty good idea. And I was like, oh yeah, maybe it's not dumb. And then I sat on it for a little while longer, again, just kind of, I guess, making up excuses. And then, as I mentioned in episode 0, I went to the Great War exhibit and the Gallipoli exhibition here in Wellington. I wasn't living in Wellington at the time, but I came anyway for a couple of other things, and we went there for that. And that was really at the point where I decided I wanted to do this. That was the point where I went, you see all these stories of, particularly of the people, of who they are, what they did, and that kind of stuff. And that's when I kind of went, wow, this is all stuff that if you don't come to New Zealand, you don't come to these museum exhibits or anything, these are stories that are really hard to find. These are people that are really hard to know who they are unless you know what you're doing, where you're looking, and how to find them, and all sorts of other stuff. So I thought that was kind of when I went, yeah, this is kind of part of the reason I want to do it, is to bring these stories to the fore, to give a more accessible way to let people hear about these stories and about these people and who they are and what they did, good, bad, or otherwise. So that was really when I decided to do it. That was really, I came back from that and was really looking at, microphones and research materials and what to do and all that kind of stuff. And and then I wasn't really sure how to go about it, so I emailed a couple of people. And quite thankfully, Robin Pearson of the History of Byzantium podcast emailed me back and answered all my questions very well. So really, you have him to thank for this entire thing. Is his advice on how to get me going is really what, was when he emailed me back and said, look, this is what you should do. And I went, fine. I went and did that. And that is really what kicked it all off. From there, and so then at that point I'd had the microphone had arrived, the books had arrived, I had read the books at least enough to write the first 3-ish episodes, and then I moved to Wellington, and I guess the rest is history. At that point, as I said, I recorded it on New Year's Day, or the day before New Year's Day, I guess, New Year's Eve, uploaded it, and away we went. Yeah, so that was, I guess, the story of how it kind of started, is it all kind of gradually built up, kind of over time. So there wasn't really, I guess the Gallipoli exhibit and stuff was kind of the hard, like, this is when I decided to do it. But even then, I'd still been thinking about it for a while. I'd still had this idea for some time. It's just that I hadn't kind of done it for various reasons. Yeah, so there wasn't really exactly kind of any kind of hard time. Although that if you need a hard time, that's when it was. But yeah, it's just something that I gradually kind of thought of over time. I built up over time. Like for example, the opening line, "Kia ora, g'day, and welcome." I had that thought up for years before I started. I'd already thought about that. I'd already known that if I was going to actually do it, that was going to be the opening. So that had been built up. That had been thought of for years. Same with the ending. Hari tu atu, hoki tu mai. Although I didn't know that specific thing. I didn't know that was the specific line that I wanted to do. I did know that I wanted what I called my John Campbell exit, basically, or my John Campbell finisher, which is, if any of you in New Zealand who you'll know, John Campbell is a very famous journalist. He used to have a show called Campbell Live, a news show called Campbell Live, and at the end he would always say, was it "Ka kite anō," and have a very good evening indeed. He always said that at the end of every single episode of his show, and I thought, I need something like that. I need that ender, for every episode. So I knew I needed that. I just didn't know what that would be. And then when I actually started the podcast, that's when I went looking for it, found it, and now it is what we use. So yeah, so that's a general overview of kind of how it got started. So plans for the future of the podcast. So where do we go, I guess, from here is what you're asking there. So in terms of what is in the immediate future, I have 4 and a bit episodes already written on tāmoko, on, Māori tattooing. So we have at least 4 episodes of that, and I'm partway through writing the 5th. So that's going to be a big one, all about, Māori tattooing, what it means, how it was done, all sorts of other stuff. It's going to be really cool. So that is going to be the episode in the next 2 weeks. The start of that is going to be in 2 weeks' time from now, if you're listening to this at time of recording. If you're listening to this in the future, the episode immediately after this will be the first tāmoko episode. So we're going to talk about that for 5 episodes. And then after that, we'll obviously do a Māori myth. At this stage, what that will be, I don't really know, because of course we have finished Maui now, and we have been talking about Maui for quite some time, so we can kind of broaden our horizons a little bit. We may do the myth of how tā moko came into the mortal plane, if you will. So we might do that story, which we do talk about in the actual episodes, but we might do it in that might add that flamboyance, I guess, of the regular kind of myth and legend episodes. So we might do that, or I might do something else. I haven't really quite decided that just as of yet. And then after that, we'll have something else, which I won't tell you just quite yet. And then we'll move on to the rest of the Māori culture episodes. So things like musical instruments, medicine, warfare, food, and anything else that I can come up with, and anything else that you think might be relevant, or that you think you might want to know, you might want me to talk about. So if there's anything you want me to talk about, please feel free to contact me. Let me know what you want to hear, what you want to know, because I can always look into it. So yeah, so that's kind of, I guess, the immediate future. So the Māori culture episodes will take us, I suspect, right to the end of 2020. What I have planned so far in terms of the tā moko episodes, and then it will be the myth episode, and then it will be the kind of stuff we're going to do afterwards, which is probably going to be 2 or 3 episodes. That's going to take us pretty much right up until kind of April, May-ish. That's going to take us nearly halfway to the year. So it's going to take us quite some time to just get there. And then, maybe a couple episodes on musical instruments, a few episodes on food, a few episodes on medicine, a few episodes on warfare, a few episodes on religion. That's the other one I'm forgetting. And if we think 2 to 3 episodes probably average, say 3 episodes average, every 2 weeks, for each topic, plus myth episodes in between all of those topics, plus anything else like collabs or special episodes that I find on other stuff or whatever in between, you are looking at probably, we probably won't finish Māori culture until the end of 2020. And then after that, of course, Abel Tasman's going to turn up. We're going to talk about him and who he is, and then kind of what happened between Abel Tasman and Cook, because I don't know what happened between that, so it'll be very interesting to see what happens between him and James Cook. And of course, James Cook turns up, and then everything's turned up to 100, and man, this shit really kicks off. So James Cook is going to arrive, and then after him, a whole bunch of other people are going to arrive, the early colonists and that kind of stuff, and then basically the rest of New Zealand history happens. So after that, early colonists will turn up. At that kind of point, we will probably do kind of bit of episodes on where they came from, who they were, a bit about, I guess, kind of British culture, culture, kind of, I guess, it'll be Māori culture episodes light, if you will. It'll be all about, similar to the Māori culture episodes, but we'll do it for Britain, because they're primarily, obviously, the people that were coming over. So kind of, what their warfare, the weapons and that kind of stuff, the military, what was that like, what was the food like, what was the housing conditions, why were they coming to New Zealand as opposed to just staying in Europe, all that kind of stuff. And it'll all be stuff that you're probably vaguely familiar with, but just kind of put it all into context of what was going on here, because of course, they are important as well, and we should know, and we do need to know what they were doing and why they were doing it, just as we need to know what Māori were doing and why they were doing it, because it all fits into that kind of greater whole. We will also probably do a kind of world at large kind of episode, probably around the time when James Cook arrives, or maybe a bit after that, but just kind of a general kind of look at what was going on in the world in terms of who were the big players, what were the major conflicts that were happening, who were the major countries, all that kind of stuff, what was going on, and that kind of thing. Just to kind of give some context around, or pull us out of that vacuum, if you will, because at the moment we're really talking about Māori culture and Māori in general in a vacuum, in the sense that they are not influenced from anything outside of New Zealand itself. And that's very, very easy for us at the moment, because by and large, In general, that is the case. There was not a huge amount of contact outside of New Zealand. So that's very, very easy to do for us at the moment. But of course, once Europeans arrive and suddenly, everything starts happening, the kind of what's going on outside of New Zealand becomes immensely more important than perhaps what it is now in our story. So we need to kind of contextualize what's happening elsewhere in the world, because of course our view is very narrow as well in terms of we're just focusing on New Zealand, and then once Europeans arrive, it becomes very much more global in terms of Britain is an entire empire that spans the globe kind of thing. So we just need to give us a bit of context as to what's going on there. And then after that, of course, we will go into the Musket Wars, and then the Treaty of Waitangi, the New Zealand Wars, and then kind of that will take us probably roughly to about the 20th century, and then on to World War One, and then the Depression years and that kind of stuff, World War Two, and then on to the Cold War era, banning of nuclear power and weapons, the Springbok Tour, sinking of the Rainbow Warrior, and all sorts of other stuff. Obviously, that is I am blasting over so many things here. But that is a very general overview of where we will be going. In terms of what we're going to be talking about. There will be so many stories within that. There will be so many things within that. Like Chinese gold miners and rail workers being brought to New Zealand. That is a whole thing in and of itself. The gold rush that happened. The Cody gum rush, essentially. That's a whole thing in and of itself. There are so many things going on in those kind of broad topics. That I don't even know about, and that kind of stuff. So yeah, but that in extremely broad strokes, that is where we are going. And of course, there's all sorts of other stuff that we're going to be talking about as well, particularly individual people. I'm really keen to talk about individual kind of stories, similar to what I did with the Barnett Burns episode on Pax Britannica. Go check that out. Kind of just focusing in on individual people and kind of what they were doing, learning about them, that kind of stuff. So particularly people like Minnie Dean, Lieutenant Colonel William Malone, all sorts of different people from all sorts of different times doing all sorts of different things. Lots of different stuff about that. And Shrek the Sheep as well. We've got to do Shrek the Sheep, although he might actually be post 2000, which is where we're going to stop. But we'll probably do him anyway, just because he's good. And different interviews and that kind of stuff as well. So all sorts of really, really different stuff. The next one we've got is seemingly ridiculous fantasies for the future of the podcast. There are a few, actually. I do actually have them written on my vague podcast outline that I wrote very, very early on. It's a bit defunct now, but there is a few there that I still like to keep just to look at them, mostly. I call them my super mega awesome never gonna happen goals. Some of them might happen, but I doubt it. Some of them are slightly more achievable. Things like visiting Waido Bar. We talked about that very early on, how it was one of the first it's the earliest Māori settlement that we have in New Zealand. It'd be really cool to go there and see what's there and just kind of walk around the place and that kind of stuff. And that is very definitely possible. In fact, it is something that we're probably going to do now that I've got a GoPro and, we can go and video it and that kind of stuff. So that's probably going to happen at some point, which is really cool. And doing similar things like that as well, going to historical sites, having a look around, making little kind of YouTube videos, that kind of stuff. Which kind of ties into one of the other ones, which was make a doco thing, of which in brackets I've put, maybe just film yourself going to historic sites or something. So I guess that's all kind of part of it, right? It'd be cool to make a little bit of a doco thing or something about an event or a person or whatever. But honestly, I probably won't end up making a doco. It'll just be lots of YouTube videos of me going to these different places and talking about them and that kind of stuff. So yeah, so that'd be pretty cool. Do something like that. And then we start entering the realm of potential things that are a bit more likely to happen. Things like making kodu, that thing from way, way, way back. It was basically made from cabbage tree hearts to, turn into like a toffee kind of licorice chewing gummy type thing. So being able to make that and kind of video it and taste it and that kind of thing, that'd be really cool. I'm really into kind of, I guess, what you'd call living history type stuff, being able to go places and do things that people were doing and experience what they were experiencing and see things that they were seeing, that kind of stuff. I like being able to stand in areas and go, wow, this is where something happened, or this is what people would have been doing, these are the kind of tools that they'd be using, and this is how you do this, and this is what they'd be eating, and this is what it tastes like, and whatever else. I'm really into that kind of living history, experiencing it for yourself kind of stuff. So I guess that's kind of what that is almost indicative of, in the same way that like visiting Wairoa Bar was kind of indicative of going to various places in New Zealand. This is kind of more indicative of a wider idea of doing things that could be quite, kind of learn more and experience more and that kind of stuff. And in kind of, again, similar vein, is doing a Hans meetup, actually going to the pub and, I don't know, doing something, or going somewhere and doing something. I've also got in brackets with Hungy, ? So that could be pretty cool if we manage to do something like that. If someone who actually knows how to do that would actually be able to, facilitate that at a gathering. I don't know. But even if it was just going to the pub and just having a few beersies or whatever, that is something that'd be quite cool to do, particularly given that, at least on my social media, I know a number of you do actually live in Wellington. Whether you'd actually turn up or not, I have no idea, but so kind of meeting up for something, that would be quite interesting. Just, I don't know, hang around, talk history, talk all sorts of other things, and it gives me a chance to meet some of you, gives you a chance to meet me, or whatever, just something like that. And then we start entering the realm of things that are definitely not going to happen. So of course, like any history podcaster worth his fucking salt, of course I've thought about copying Mike Duncan's idea, and now Robin Pearson's idea of doing a History of Aotearoa New Zealand tour. Basically going up the length of the country and stopping off at various sites, doing various things, history and I guess New Zealand native species related. I don't think that will happen. It'd be cool if it did, but I don't think that'll happen. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess, one of the far more far-fetched ones. It's probably less far-fetched than the other thing that is the first thing on this list. That this list was written very, very early on, like within probably the first few weeks, maybe even the first few days of me recording the episodes and getting this whole thing going. And this was the first thing on my list, which was make the Bob sample. And I don't mean like, let's make a let's not make a bit of merch or like a toy or a plushie or some bollocks like that. There are no living in quotation marks, there are no existing, as far as I'm aware, because they're all dismantled, there are no existing Bob Semple tanks left in the world. Obviously there was only 3 made. I would absolutely love to build one as close to the originals as possible. And of course that would have a variety of issues, whether that particular tractor still exists, obviously getting Bren guns would be rather difficult, that kind of stuff. Obviously there's a whole raft of issues, not just in terms of practicality but also historical accuracy. Obviously we'd want it to be as close to the original as possible. So yeah, but I think that would be a great idea. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could build, get some people involved who actually know what they're doing, in terms of mechanics and that kind of stuff. And actually get a Bob Semple tank that, if it doesn't shoot, at least drives. And again, I guess that kind of ties into the living, the kind of living and experiencing history. Get into the tank, lay on the mattress, see what it would be like. That kind of stuff. Being able to just kind of ride in it, drive around in it, and see what it would be like. I think that would be amazing. And not only would it be just something really cool to do, it would be really cool to help spread the story of Bob Semple and his tank and that kind of stuff. And I really think it would be a genuinely great thing to have for history teaching as well. You get lots of places in overseas, and they have all these people that have tanks, they drive the tank around and they come to schools and stuff, and you get to climb on the tank or hang around the tank and ask the guys questions. Imagine that, rocking up to your school, and it's like, this was our tank. This is what we built. I think that would be really cool. But the likelihood of that happening, I think, is so astronomically out there that, like, I'm not even considering, like, investigating it at all. Maybe one day, but man, it is definitely a very out there goal. So hopefully, when asking that question, that's what you wanted to know, was these really weird goals that I have. So that's what I guess the kind of very far-fetched goals that I have are. Def need to know what you wear while recording. So this was because I just randomly decided to chuck in one of the kind of promos of, hey, you should ask me questions, what you want to know, if you want to know what I wear while recording. I don't know how to tell you guys this. I just wear my dressing gown. And that's it. Usually. Sometimes I'll add other clothes. Like I am actually wearing more than that now, but more often than not, I am not wearing very much at all, and this is just because I'm at home and I'm comfortable, and that is what I feel like when, that's what I wear when I'm comfortable. Some people wear, stretcher pants, some people, wear pajamas. I wear my dressing gown. Where do your listeners live? What's the most surprising thing about your listenership? So unsurprisingly, to start with, about 50% of listeners come from New Zealand or based in New Zealand, which makes a lot of sense. You'd expect a New Zealand history podcast would have people generally living in New Zealand, which I think is obvious on the one hand, that most people from New Zealand, the most popular region that this podcast gets to is New Zealand, the place that it's about. But I also think it definitely illustrates the kind of need for this at the moment in New Zealand. If you're keeping up with kind of vaguely New Zealand current affairs, I guess, it's recently been announced, or I say recently, it was back in September, that it was announced that New Zealand history in schools would be compulsory, which, as I mentioned earlier, it's not at the moment because I didn't get taught it. It was at teacher discretion. But now, as of, I think it's 2021, it will be compulsory to have some stuff, and they'll be talking about the New Zealand Wars, early European colonization, that kind of stuff, and what Māori were doing before that. So kind of roughly all the stuff that we're going to talk about, and of course in an age-appropriate manner, obviously. So that's kind of a big thing at the moment, and I really think that the fact that most of my listenership, or at least the largest group of my listenership, is in New Zealand, really shows that there is a need for this. That really shows there is a desire and a hunger and a real feeling that people want to know this stuff, but there has not been a good way to get at it, short of reading very large and sometimes very dry books. So that I think is really indicative of that people really want this. And I think that's on the one hand, great. That's awesome that there is a need for that, there is a want for that, and people are keen to get to it. They're keen to get at it. It's just that the access has not been there. And that's kind of how I view myself. I am filling this gap of access. I am filling this gap that people don't want to read large, dry books, and I don't fucking blame you. They are very large, and they are sometimes extremely dry. But turning it into something accessible and easy to listen to, that's what I think is missing, or has been missing, up until myself came along, and that other Radio New Zealand one that we don't mention also came along. So I feel that that's what has been missing. So I'm really glad that, at least in my eyes, it seems that I am filling that gap, that people are, it wasn't that people didn't want to know, it's just people didn't know how to get at it, or just didn't want to get at it because it was in the most boring form, essentially. So unsurprisingly, most of my listenership, or at least the largest proportion of my listenership, comes from New Zealand. And the next bit did surprise me, was that it Hans has apparently some worldwide appeal. About 20 to 21%, if I remember rightly, comes from the States, from the US. Now, in terms of it being the US is the next largest, that's not probably that surprising, given that, the US tends to be one of the larger, consumers of podcasts. I think Australia is the next kind of largest consumer, or one of the largest consumers of podcasts. So that's not surprising. I probably would have, if I had to pick, I probably would have picked the United States as my second biggest. But 1/5 of my listeners, I wouldn't have guessed that. So that's really interesting. About 1/5 of my listeners are from the United States. And then it's about, I think, 10% are from Australia, about 5% from Great Britain, and I think there's about 5% from Canada as well. So it's very clearly more popular in, I guess, what you'd call the Anglosphere, the English-speaking countries, former British Empire, current Commonwealth, those kind of countries. Obviously, it's going to have more appeal in those countries, partially because, New Zealand history is intertwined with a lot of those nations, or those nations have experienced similar histories at the hands of the British Empire, if you want to put it that way. So it makes sense that those countries would be interested, but also, of course, because the podcast is in English, so it makes sense again that the English-speaking countries would tend to favour, the podcast would tend to be favoured in those countries, as opposed to, say, like other European countries, France and Germany, or even Asian countries as well, and that kind of thing, where English is still spoken but less prominent than other languages. So the surprising thing was that it does have worldwide appeal. I look on a website called Chartable, which is quite popular among podcasters, and I reasonably frequently crop up in the history charts for other countries. I come up in Australia every so often, which is probably not super surprising, but places like Denmark, Switzerland, Mexico I was in briefly, I think Italy briefly. You end up, obviously, sometimes a few people will watch something or listen to it, and then that shoots it up, but and then it might only do that for like a day or so. But generally, at least at the moment, Switzerland and Denmark, I tend to be quite high in them, reasonably consistently, which don't know why that is. So hello, those of you from Denmark and Switzerland. But I don't know why you're listening. I don't know what makes you guys particularly interested in New Zealand history, but apparently you are. So so that was kind of surprising, is some of these kind of these countries where I not just like sometimes occasionally popular, maybe as I said, a few people just listen to it, and that might just push me up for a couple of days, but seemingly are consistently listening. for some time, which is great. That's awesome. It's just, I never really guessed it would have had this much worldwide appeal, I suppose you could say. Alright, on to some other stuff. What is your favourite New Zealand bird, mammal, or extinct species? So let's give one of each. My favourite New Zealand bird is... that's a really difficult one, actually. My favourite tends to be whatever I've just learnt something about recently. So I was really into the hihi from the previous episode that we did not too long ago. But I am quite partial to the ruru, the moorpork. I think they are really an amazing kind of bird. And it all really comes down to the way that they sound. That they are, they're named moorpork because of the sound that they make, because it sounds like someone saying more pork. And that's just, it's amazing in and of itself, but also it's amazing that when you hear them out in the wild, they are just so haunting. They are, there's something about it that really makes it sound disturbing, and just something about it makes it sound really haunting and disturbing, particularly when it's, it's obviously at night, it's really dark, and, that kind of stuff. So, they're really, really kind of, I guess, sort of thematic animals, I guess, if you want to call it that. But I also like things like, kingfishers are awesome, things like, obviously, the classics, kia, kakapo, weka are really cool. I like all New Zealand birds. I don't really have one that I particularly like. I quite like penguins as well. I've worked with penguins before. Things like yellow-eyed penguins or little blue penguins I have had specific involvement with, in terms of I've actually physically handled them. So that's really cool. Kiriru, I've looked after one of those as well. All sorts of different things are really, really amazing. They're all, at least in New Zealand, they're all vastly unique. Obviously, lots of different places have very unique animals. But New Zealand, a lot of our birds are just something entirely different, compared to other places in the world, and compared to each other even as well. So, I can't really guess. I guess pick one. My favourite New Zealand bird. Favourite New Zealand mammal. In that regard, there's not a lot to choose from there. Because if we're talking about native mammals, there's only two, and they're both bats. So I guess I got to say bats. Native New Zealand mammal bats, because all the other ones are ruining the environment, and I don't really like them for that. And in terms of extinct species, the huia is a really nice looking bird. That's part of the reason why it's extinct. But it probably has to go to something like the Haast eagle or Squawkzilla, as they've now dubbed it, which is the 1 meter tall parrot, or the I think it's called the Waitara giant penguin, which is like a penguin that's basically the size of a person. It's huge. Things like obviously the moa is a really cool one. All sorts of different ones. Again, not really. There's a lot to choose from when it comes to extinct species, unfortunately. Lots of different ones there. I don't know if I could really pick one, but probably Haast eagle. Haast eagle is super cool in just its size and its kind of power, and I guess the mythos kind of around it. It's kind of got this lore and kind of this feeling of, I guess grandeur around it as well. Can anything, in fact, beat Wellington on a nice day? Okay, for starters, the actual saying is beat Wellington on a good day, but I'll let you away with that one. I would personally probably say a hashtag Dunners Stunner, which is what they call a nice day in Dunedin. Because the thing about Wellington is it's always windy. Wellington, when it's a nice day, like it is now, I'm looking out my window and it is a nice day, but it'll be blowing its ass out there, and that's a problem. It's always a problem. So yeah, it's a nice day, or it's a good day, but it can definitely be beaten by the fact that if it wasn't blowing its guts out, it would definitely be a lot better. So there's that. So on to more kind of history-based questions now, although you've been listening to me talk history for basically this whole episode. But that's what we do here. I don't know why you didn't expect it if you didn't. So, But what period of history are you most looking forward to talking about, and why? That isn't Bob Semple and his tank. Yeah, you definitely called me out on that one. But what period am I most looking forward to? I think the kind of conflicts and I guess interactions between Europeans and Māori is something that I am very excited to talk about. Which I guess it doesn't really extend to any kind of particular I guess period or event or anything like that, but I guess if you have to pick the poster child for that, it'd be the Treaty of Waitangi. The Treaty of Waitangi is one of the things that I feel makes New Zealand really unique in what it is in terms of its I guess kind of its founding and its makeup and its cultural interactions and its political and economic landscape and all sorts of other things. So, and that at the very least makes New Zealand interesting in its interactions between Europeans and Māori, all throughout history. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm really interested to talk about. How kind of the Treaty of Waitangi, how did that kind of happen? How did that go down? What does that mean? Of the other obvious one, I guess, being, when the early explorers turned up, Abel Tasman, James Cook, what were their interactions like? Yeah, I guess kind of the period I'm looking forward to is the Treaty of Waitangi and the New Zealand Wars, even the Musket Wars, and that kind of stuff. I think that's probably going to be, World War One, World War Two, all of that. That's also going to be really interesting. But I feel like, I guess that the kind of 1800s, that is the kind of period I think that I will enjoy personally the most, and that I am looking forward to looking into the most. So yeah. So the next one is a bit of a long one. So it says, I'd love to know what your political opinion is on history taught in schools. When I grew up, we were taught about a whole bunch of crap that was probably great history. However, I couldn't relate to any of it. Whereas now, I'm in my 30s. I love your podcast. Thanks very much. It's interesting for Kiwis. My kids love it. What I let them listen to, that is. Should the New Zealand curriculum be completely overhauled? If yes, would you consider signing up for Education Minister? I'm going to answer that second question right out of the gate. No. I will not get into politics at all. I think it's bollocks. I don't think it's worthwhile on that front. I also generally most of the time have no idea what I'm talking about. So, there's that. But in terms of the I guess the wider point of your question, the New Zealand curriculum, I've kind of alluded to this already, I guess, but it definitely does need to be overhauled, and it is going to be overhauled in terms of history. So that's great that New Zealand kids are going to learn about our history, about where we came from, who we are, and I guess what that means for today and how we got here, but also what that means for how we need to look at things and how we proceed into the future. Because of course that's essentially what it's all about, right? So yeah, it does definitely need to be completely overhauled, and I guess it already is. It is going to be overhauled, but the question is, how do you teach history? Because just how you teach it is just as important as whether we should teach it. Obviously, we've decided that we should teach it, but how do we teach it? What parts do we teach? What do we focus on? What do we not focus on? And I guess in what light do we focus on it? And that's kind of I grapple with this nearly every day. How do I present these things? How do I portray them? How do you set them up? in the most unbiased light as possible in my case. Of course, I would assume that the government doesn't want to put any bias on certain things, but you never know, right? You never know what kind of agenda people have in terms of the people making the curriculum, how they, what do they want to portray? How do they want to have people see things? So you never know. But yeah, I think the really big question is, how do we teach it? How do we teach it, our history, to kids, and how do we teach it to people in general? Personally, I think we've got to teach it in the most unbiased light as possible. And that's, again, as I mentioned earlier, that's not always going to be possible. You're not always going to be able to do that. But it's something we should strive towards, I feel. It is definitely something that we should at least try to do, is try to teach it as unbiased as we possibly can. And obviously we should make it age appropriate. Obviously kids aren't, depending on the age, aren't going to, you probably shouldn't be teaching kids about, very gruesome things and that kind of stuff, or giving them very gory details. But at the same time, of course, there are certain concepts that younger kids are just not going to understand. So I guess a lot of it is what do we focus on as well. What events do we focus on? What people do we focus on? And that kind of stuff. And personally, for that level, if you're talking, like kind of high school and kind of earlier, it's really the big picture stuff, I feel personally. Obviously the Treaty of Waitangi is something that they should focus on. That is an extremely important event. But they will be focusing as well on the New Zealand Wars, the early colonial era and that kind of stuff. And I feel that that's probably the way to go. Yeah, so I definitely think, at least in this early stage of what I've read a little bit about, I think what the government are doing is pretty good. Gets a thumbs up from me. That opinion may change depending on how things go forward. But hey, I think, acknowledging you have a problem is the first step to fixing the problem, is kind of how I feel about it. Our next question is, wanted to ask, what piqued your interest in learning the Māori language? Is there more than one dialect or a single Māori language? So what piqued my interest is the fact that it is one of New Zealand's official languages. In the same way that, you go to France and one of them is French. It is something that is part of who we are, and you see it everywhere in New Zealand. You see it on signs and sides of buildings, and in the news, on the TV, on my computer, everywhere. It's literally everywhere, which is awesome. But I don't know a lot of it. I don't know what a lot of it means. I do now that I've learned a lot of different words and what those mean. You can infer what certain things are and what they're trying to get at and that kind of thing. And I guess that's part of it, is it's all about broadening your horizons, broadening, trying to think in different ways and trying to see things in a different light, and learning a different language is all kind of part of that. So, that's, I guess, what kind of, that's part of what piqued my interest about it. But also because you can't talk about New Zealand history without, without Te Reo. You just can't. There is no way I could do the stuff we've been talking about so far without actually, without including Te Reo Māori somewhere along the way. So that's kind of it's all part of it, right? It's all about broadening your horizons and getting it into the podcast and spreading it around for other people as well. I hope a lot of you overseas have learnt at least a couple of new words, that maybe you even use in your everyday life, which would be really cool. So it's all about, that's kind of what it's all about, and it's just interesting. I mean, I've always been kind of interested in kind of etymology, what makes up words, how do we use words, where do they come from, language in general, and how that English differs from other languages, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, so that's kind of, I'm just generally interested in language in general. So that's kind of part of it as well. So yeah, so hopefully one day we can get a kind of a language expert on who, I guess, somewhat specialises in Te Reo, to kind of talk about it and to kind of kind of talk to us about, kind of how the language is made up and what that means for the language in terms of how it relates to other languages and how it changes the way you think, because the language you speak does change the way that you think. And also what I'm really interested is about how it was taken from a completely oral language without any written to how it was now written. One of the things being that I recently learned that lots of other, all the other, in fact, Polynesian languages, they were the same, and they all have F in their alphabet, essentially in their written alphabet, to make the f sound, make the typical F sound, when they were transferred from totally oral to written. So they all have that F in their written language. New Zealand doesn't, though, or Te Reo Māori doesn't, though. It only has the WH, which makes the F sound, makes the f sound, which is obviously rather curious for a number of different reasons. Because for one, if everyone else has got the F, why do we not have the F? And for at least most people, WH is not an intuitive F sound. So why do we have that and no one else does? And from what I understand, citation needed on this, but this is what I've been told, is that it is because the guy who was doing it, or one of the lead guys who was turning Te Reo Māori into a written language, spoke Gaelic, or he was from that kind of Irish, Scottish region of the world, and he spoke Gaelic, and so in Gaelic, apparently WH makes that F sound, it makes the F sound. So that's what he did. He went, to me, this is intuitive, I'm going to put it in the language. And so that's why you get things like that, with things like whakatane, or whānau, and that kind of stuff. The WH makes the F sound, because the guy was Gaelic, and it's in Gaelic. And as to, is there a single dialect or a single Māori language? This is a question for someone a lot smarter than me. But from, I guess, what I understand, it's all different dialects, right? It's you get lots of different kind of things going on, depending on where, what region you're looking at, essentially. So things like people around Wanganui, they don't use the WH as an F sound, because Wanganui is actually spelt WHANGNUI. Yeah? Anyway, it's got the WH at the start, right? But it's not pronounced with the F sound, with the F sound, unless you speak Te Reo Māori from a different area. So if you're, say, from, I don't know, Wellington. Say you're from Wellington, you'd call it Whanganui, not Wanganui. Whereas people from Wanganui would call it Wanganui. And so that's kind of a little bit of a dialect thing there, right? It is a slight difference. Similar thing down with in kind of the South Island, with Ngaitahu. They replace the NG in things like Nai. They replace it with a K. So actually, when referencing themselves, they will often call themselves Kaitahu instead. So that's again another kind of a dialectic difference. I guess that's what you'd call it. So from what I understand, it's different dialects. There are a few different dialects, and I don't think the problem with it is it is a bit messy at the moment, because of course a lot of these iwi lost their language for a number of years. I think Ngāti Kahungunu is one of the big ones that just outright lost their dialect for a couple of decades, and so trying to build that back is near impossible, because no one is alive anymore that had it before, that actually knows it. So it's a bit hard, right? Because some areas will have, I guess, their own kind of very particular dialect, and some will have less so, and so it's all a bit messy. So again, not really something I think I am qualified to answer in any kind of informative way. But hopefully that gives you a general idea, at least. So hopefully as well we can find someone who knows a lot more about that, and then we can get them on, which would be awesome. Alright, our next one is, if you're not of Māori ancestry, why are you so interested in their culture? Now, I'll be entirely honest, I'm slightly confused by this question, just because I don't think having any particular ancestry needs to be a predecessor, essentially, or a predication to being interested in a culture. I'm not of French, German, Mongolian, Chinese, or American ancestry, but I'm all interested in those cultures as well. You know, I'm not necessarily limited to just Māori culture. I'm interested in history in general, which of course it involves all sorts of different cultures, African cultures, you know, Polynesian cultures, Native American cultures, you know, all that kind of stuff. You know, Asian cultures, European cultures, all of it. I'm interested in all sorts of different things, and for a good 90% of it, I have no whakapapa, no ancestry back to it at all. So, yeah, so I'm not really sure what kind of answer you're expecting with this one, dear listener, I'm afraid. Because, yeah, I just don't think there needs to be, I don't think I need to be or have any Māori ancestry to be interested in Māori culture. But I guess if you really want an answer, it's because it is part of the culture here in New Zealand. You know, it is all around me nearly every day, at least in terms of, you know, the language. I see it every day. But you see a lot on the news. You know, you'll see things like hui and porphyry and you know, all sorts of other things, and it's everywhere. It's all around us. Or at least me here in New Zealand. So, you know, it stands to reason that I should learn more about it. On to the next one. While the Māoris were doing their thing in Aotearoa, what was happening nearby in Australia, New Caledonia, and Fiji? So just before we crack into this this question properly, I just want to address the use of the word Māoris, as in adding the S to the end of Māori to make it plural. So Te Reo Māori doesn't have S as a letter, it's just not used. And as such, it's not used as an addition to a word to make something plural. So if you want to, for example, make the word Māori plural, you don't need to add anything. Māori is already a plural, in the same way that sheep is plural, or fish is plural, or that kind of stuff. So you don't need to do anything there. And the reason I wanted to address that, not just because you know, to teach you something, because I think that's kind of interesting, but also because if you do come to New Zealand and you start talking about Māoris, some people may take that as a racist remark. You know, some people might take that less than positively. So, you know, just be mindful of that kind of stuff. But as to the actual question itself, again, I don't really have an answer for this. I'm not very schooled up, as it were, in the histories of Australia, New Caledonia, and Fiji. Short of there were people there and they were doing something. What that something was, I have no idea. So yeah, I don't really know. And in a similar vein, is there evidence of seagoing trade between New Zealand and Australia during the early Māori period? As far as I am aware, the answer to that is no. There is, as far as I can tell from the admittedly extremely minimal research I've done into this, there doesn't seem to be any records of Māori being aware Australia was even there. So there was no contact whatsoever between Australian Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people or Māori early on, or at all, up until obviously Europeans turned up, and then I guess they let everyone know that, hey, there's a giant ass desert like not that far away. So yeah, so as far as I can tell, there seems to have been no contact whatsoever between Māori and Aboriginal peoples, or even other Polynesians as well. I believe there is some evidence to suggest that Māori may have been in contact with some Polynesian island groups at some point, particularly early on. But I don't think there was a huge amount. I think once they came to New Zealand, it was just generally a bit too far, particularly as kind of particularly after the early period and the more sort of transitional tribal periods came about. That was it became less and less. So it does seem, in general, as I mentioned earlier, it does seem that Māori were fairly isolated from other, island and continental groups and that kind of stuff. Now on to some other questions that are just kind of sort of a bit out there and just I didn't really know where to put them because they didn't really fit into any group. So do you think the predominance of the All Blacks in World Rugby is due to a strong culture of rugby in New Zealand opposed to in Australia where it competes with Aussie rules, NRL, soccer, etc.? If I'm entirely honest, I don't actually follow rugby that much. I only really follow it when there's something exciting happening, which is really only during the World Cup, when we have an extremely good chance of winning, except for this year in 2019 when we didn't. But I mean, I guess I'm inclined to say yes, because in general, boys play rugby, girls play netball, and obviously things like soccer, is quite popular as well. And of course, every other sport is, also exists, I guess. But yeah, in general, rugby is the thing that boys do when they're younger. If you're going to pick a sport, rugby is usually the one to do. Or cricket. Cricket is the other big one, I guess, as well. It's not as big as rugby, I don't think. But so it's... Yeah, I do think it is because Australia has all these other ones that are, as close in popularity to rugby as well. Again, citation needed. Don't really know too much about that. And the last kind of major question that we have is, where in New Zealand would you recommend someone from the US trying to live in New Zealand look first? Where is expensive? Where is the best? So... in general, the main centres, so that is Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington, Christchurch, Dunedin, they are quite expensive. Pretty much all across... the further north you get in general, it gets more expensive. Auckland is the most expensive as far as I'm aware. It is very expensive in Auckland. It is quite expensive here in Wellington. But as you go further south, it does get cheaper. Dunedin is quite a bit cheaper. Invercargill is quite a bit cheaper. So there is that. So that's something to consider, is where in the country you want to be and how that impacts how much you want to pay. But of course, that also impacts how much you can earn. Obviously, Wellington and Auckland, depending on your profession, has a lot more opportunities than, say, Dunedin or Invercargill, or even Christchurch in some regards. So it depends on what you're doing and kind of, I guess, where the opportunities are. And of course, that as part of that, if you go into like the regions, if you want to live more rurally, out in the country, that is again quite a bit cheaper. But again, less opportunities out in the country. A lot of people don't want to live out there for a variety of different reasons. So... so it kind of depends on, I guess, where where the opportunities are and that kind of thing. But in general, yeah, places like Auckland and Wellington going to be more expensive than, say, Dunedin or Invercargill. So smaller areas, smaller opportunities, less people, all that kind of stuff. All similar kind of things I expect you would probably find in other areas of the world as well, even in the US. And as to where is the best, again, that depends on what you're looking for. Wellington is kind of, I guess, one of the cultural capitals of New Zealand. It's got a lot going on. There's a lot of events, a lot of festivals, a lot of that kind of stuff. Whereas Auckland obviously is a bigger city. I was going to say a big city, but I suppose by United States standards, it's not a big city. But, that has a lot more things happening, but of course the traffic is terrible. But, yeah, so that's different. Whereas Dunedin and Invercargill, for example, a lot quieter, but there's a bit less going on. Dunedin is trying to get lots of gigs, like lots of big acts coming down, musical acts in particular coming down, but they don't tend to go there because, it's not as many people, that kind of stuff. Dunedin in particular is a student city, so if you live in, say, North Dunedin, it's going to be filled with students for 6 months of the year, and with everything that comes along with it. Dunedin's also very cold. It's one of the coldest places in the country, same with, like Southland and Otago in general, whereas it's a lot more warmer, a bit more tropical. Not quite tropical, but, a bit warmer up in the north. So I guess it kind of depends on what you're looking for. So I guess I haven't really answered your question. It really does depend. But if I guess you say, where would you look first? Auckland would be the place that you look first, because that is essentially the place that's going to have the most opportunities because there's the most people there. So I think, but if you're not keen on Auckland, Wellington is, at least from what I've experienced, your next best bet. Wellington is great. I love Wellington. So yeah, but again, I'm biased because I live here, so there's that. And so that brings us to the end, basically, of our final episode of 2019. But what I thought I might do, just very briefly, is to kind of give you some stats of what we've done in this first year. Because this is, quite frankly, this has quite astounded me how big this has gotten. I started this podcast nearly, as I've been kept repeating, nearly 1 year ago, just in my room, with a microphone, talking into this microphone about stuff that I'd researched, and I still do that, but I had no idea if anyone would listen. I had no idea if people would find this interesting. I had no idea if I was just talking to the void and I was just putting this thing up and it would be ignored for forever, basically. But I will admit, to blow my own trumpet, I will admit that I at no point did I feel that this could not be successful. At no point have I felt that, even when I felt whether, asking myself whether anyone's going to listen to this, at no point did I feel that this didn't have potential. I have never felt that this couldn't be successful. It's just, I didn't think it would be this successful this fast. I had set myself a lofty but achievable goal of hitting the #1 history podcast in New Zealand within, the first 2 or 3 years. I thought, and if that didn't happen, then fine. If I was really speaking out into the void, then wow, whatever. But I felt that it was achievable. It could be done. I felt I could become the #1 history podcast listened to by Kiwis, within the first few years. I ended up doing that within the first 8 months, which is, quite frankly, mind-boggling, at least to me. To take that even further, we are regularly in the top 200 out of all podcasts listened to by New Zealanders. So, out of that, every genre, out of every podcast that people in New Zealand listen to, we are consistently up there. We are consistently within the top 200. The latest, I think the highest I've ever been, which was recently, was number 40, which is amazing. I didn't think I could be the #1 podcast in New Zealand. I didn't think that was possible. I was happy with my very small corner being like, yeah, I could probably get to #1 in history in New Zealand. I could probably achieve that. It's gotten to the point where it looks achievable that we could make it to at least briefly, maybe very briefly, we could make it to the #1 #1 podcast listened to by New Zealanders, which is mind-boggling. Is just, I cannot fathom being the thing that, being the podcast that is most listened to here in New Zealand. So thank you, those of you, at least in New Zealand, who are listening to it and who those stats count towards. Thank you for listening and reviewing us and all that kind of thing. It's really great that all of you out there are enjoying, what we do, what we talk about, and all that kind of stuff. Thank you, those of you in New Zealand. Thank you, those of you who are overseas, who have listened to the podcast, who have, have been enjoying it and have been sending in your feedback as well. I've had a number of emails this year in regards to, people enjoying the podcast and what they want to know about and things that they learned and all that kind of stuff. And that is amazing. I'm really glad that there are people out there who are all over the world that are listening and are learning new things and that kind of stuff. My philosophy, or part of the philosophy behind this, has definitely been if you can come away from this with one interesting fact that you can tell your workmates that you think is really interesting, that's my job done. You don't have to remember everything. You don't have to be, you don't have to remember all the things that we talk about in every single little detail. But if you can come away with one thing and then go to work the next day and go, hey, I learnt this really cool thing last night, then I think that's a win in my eyes. So yeah, so that's kind of, I guess, what we're trying to achieve is just getting really, we're not trying to get you to remember everything, but if you can remember even just a little bit, that is more than what you knew before. That is more than what was out there before, and that's the main thing. So I guess just to try and for those stats, I did mention stats. Since August, which is when we changed our podcast host, we have had 45,000 downloads, which translates to roughly 10,000 downloads a month, give or take. Which is, at least to me, a mind-boggling amount, which I've said a lot, but it is quite a lot to me that there are, there has been 45,000 downloads and listens of Hans all over the world, which is amazing, which is awesome. So we've really spread our reach quite wide in terms of that. Lots of people, listening and learning and all that kind of stuff. But not only that, for those of you who might be unaware, the podcast made it onto Air New Zealand as well. We are on all international flights on Air New Zealand planes. So if you are on an Air New Zealand aircraft right now, hello! I hope you are having a good and enjoyable flight to or from New Zealand or wherever you are going. Which has been phenomenal. So thank you, Air New Zealand, for letting me talk history stuff on your planes. So that's really, really cool. And I've been to a few different things talking about the podcast in a few different capacities as well, which has been really, really fantastic. This, as I said, although I never doubted that this could be successful, I did not realize how rapidly successful, I guess, it would be. So thank you, all of you who have been listening and who have been, sending me emails and whatever else, or even if you've just listening to this and you've never talked to me, hello and thank you to you too. Hopefully you have learned something. So I guess I better start rambling. It's been about 2 hours now that I've been at least talking. So I better let it all go and finish it all off. So that's it from me for 2019. We will be back in the new year in 2020. We will be starting out our chats into tāmoko, which is Māori tattooing. As well as a whole raft of other subjects that we will talk about in 2020 and beyond. So one last time, thank you all very much for making Hans's first year as immensely Let's try that again, eh? Making Hans's year as immensely successful as it has been. And I hope all of you have a very fun and safe new year. As always, haere tu atu, hoki tu mai. See you next time.